The day I got fired, the woman who fired me had not even finished setting up her company email. She sat behind my desk like she owned the place. Her expensive blazer still looked brand new, and the welcome packet beside her had barely been opened. A nervous HR assistant stood behind her, holding a tablet with both hands, looking like he wanted to disappear. Without looking me in the eye, she cleared her throat and read from a prepared statement. Effective immediately, your employment with the company has been terminated. Security will escort you from the building. That was it. No warning. No explanation. No conversation. 30 years of loyalty erased in less than 15 seconds. The funny thing was that she genuinely believed she was the most powerful person in the room. My name is Evelyn Carter, and before that day was over, the woman who fired me was about to learn a lesson that would cost her everything. I stood up calmly and adjusted my jacket. After decades of dealing with investors, regulators, lawyers, and corporate egos, I had learned one thing. The person who loses control first usually loses the fight. The HR assistant waited for me to argue. I didn't. Instead, I removed my badge and placed it neatly on the desk. Then I looked directly at the woman. Her name was Madison Reed. 6 months earlier, she had married the founder's son. Somehow, she had convinced herself that marriage automatically qualified her to help run a billion-dollar company. I smiled politely. I hope everything goes smoothly at the board meeting this afternoon. For the first time, she looked confused. What board meeting? She asked. I could have explained. I could have warned her. Instead, I wished her luck and walked out. Behind me, I heard her laugh. That laugh stayed with me all morning. Not because it bothered me, because I knew exactly how quickly it would disappear. Most people believed this company belonged to the founder, Richard Holloway. His face appeared in magazines. His interviews generated headlines. His name was attached to every success story. But companies are not built by headlines. They're built by systems. While Richard chased investors and publicity, I built the structure holding everything together. Contracts, compliance programs, shareholder agreements, governance policies, legal protections. All the things nobody noticed until something went wrong. Most executives wanted promotions. I wanted ownership. Every time a major deal closed, I negotiated shares instead of bonuses. People laughed. They called me boring. They said I lacked ambition. They were wrong. A title belongs to the company. Ownership belongs to you. Year after year, my stake grew. 1% became 5. 5 became 15. 15 became 30. Then opportunities appeared. Investors sold. Executives left. Shareholders needed cash. Quietly, I bought what they sold. Nobody paid attention. Until one day I owned 72% of the company. 72%. More than enough to control everything. And buried deep inside the shareholder agreement was a clause I had written 17 years earlier. A clause designed for one purpose: protecting the company from reckless people who thought power came from a job title. Madison had no idea it existed. But with one careless signature that morning, she had just activated it. And the countdown to her downfall had officially begun. While Madison celebrated her first day in power, I was already setting something much bigger into motion. The moment I left the building, I sat inside my car and opened my laptop. Years earlier, I had prepared for a situation exactly like this. Not because I expected it to happen, but because experience had taught me that eventually someone always mistakes authority for ownership. Within minutes, I began sending emails. Not ordinary emails. Legal notices. Board notifications. Shareholder disclosures. Activation documents. Every board member received a copy. Every major investor received a copy. The legal department received a copy. Outside counsel received a copy. And attached to every message was the same document. Clause 17C. For 17 years, that clause had remained untouched inside the shareholder agreement. Most executives had forgotten it existed. Some probably never knew it was there. That morning, Madison unknowingly brought it back to life. The rule was simple. If a non-equity executive terminated a corporate officer without board approval, their authority would immediately be suspended. Control would temporarily return to the majority shareholder until an emergency board review could take place. And since I owned 72% of the company, everyone knew exactly who that majority shareholder was. Meanwhile, Madison was having the best day of her life. Employees later told me she ordered champagne before noon. She walked through the executive floor giving instructions to managers who had been there longer than she had. She talked about culture changes, restructuring plans, and leadership vision. By lunchtime, she was already acting like she had conquered the company. What she didn't realize was that people across the country were opening legal packets that threatened to end her authority before her first workday was over. The first person who understood how serious the situation was happened to be Richard Holloway's personal attorney. The moment he read the activation notice, he stopped what he was doing. He read it once, then again, then a third time. Finally, he grabbed his phone and called Richard. At that exact moment, Richard was playing golf at an exclusive country club. The first call was ignored. The second call was ignored too. When the third call came through, Richard finally answered. "This better be important," he snapped. His attorney didn't waste time. "You need to get back to headquarters immediately." "Why?" There was a brief pause. Then came the answer. "Your daughter-in-law just triggered a corporate emergency." Richard laughed. At first. Then the attorney explained what had happened. The laughter disappeared. 20 minutes later, Richard stormed into headquarters and headed straight for the executive conference room. Legal staff were already waiting. Senior executives looked nervous. Nobody was smiling. The attorney handed him a folder. As Richard read the documents, the color slowly drained from his face. Finally, he looked up. "Who signed the termination order?" Nobody answered. He asked again, louder this time. The attorney took a deep breath. "Madison." The room fell completely silent. And for the first time that day, Richard realized his family's biggest mistake wasn't hiring Madison. It was firing the one person who actually controlled the company. By noon, the first signs of trouble started appearing. Madison was sitting in my old office, staring out at the city skyline, while sipping champagne. She had spent the entire morning giving orders and acting like she had already secured her place at the top. Then something strange happened. Her inbox went quiet. No congratulations from investors. No messages from board members. No support from senior executives. At first, she ignored it. Then she noticed something else. The executive dashboard on her laptop stopped working. She refreshed the page. Nothing. She tried again. An error message appeared. Access denied. Madison frowned. She attempted to open shareholder records. Denied. She tried approving a departmental budget. Denied. She attempted to access executive reports. Denied. The systems weren't crashing. They were rejecting her. For the first time all day, uncertainty crossed her face. Downstairs, the IT department had already discovered why. Earlier that morning, Madison had sent an email demanding that all of my accounts be disabled immediately. She wanted every trace of me removed from the company. The IT director received the request and began reviewing the system registry. What he found nearly made him fall out of his chair. My name was attached to everything. Primary Compliance Authority, Lead Digital Signatory, Investor Portal Administrator, Corporate Governance Controller, Majority Shareholder, 72% ownership. Removing my access would cripple critical systems tied to investors, compliance reporting, and legal filings. Instead of following Madison's order, the IT director quietly walked into legal carrying his laptop. "You need to see this," he said. The attorneys reviewed the records. A few minutes later, legal issued one simple instruction. Do not touch her access. No debate. No discussion. Nobody wanted responsibility for creating an even bigger disaster. Meanwhile, the emergency board meeting was getting closer. Board members were arriving from across the city. Lawyers filled conference rooms. Executives cancelled appointments. The mood inside headquarters had completely changed. Employees could feel it. Managers checked their phones every few minutes. Nobody knew exactly what, except the people reading the legal documents. Those people already knew the truth. Madison's authority was gone. She simply hadn't realized it yet. Back in her office, she reopened the social media post she had been writing earlier. Today I made my first difficult leadership decision. Great leaders make tough choices for the future. She stared at the words. Suddenly they didn't sound impressive anymore. Then her phone buzzed. A text message from one of the company's largest investors. She smiled. Finally, she thought, someone important is reaching out. She opened the message. The smile disappeared instantly. The text contained only one sentence. What exactly is happening with Evelyn? A second message arrived. Please tell me this situation is under control. Then another. And another. Every message focused on the same person. Me. For the first time that day, Madison realized something terrifying. The investors weren't worried about losing an employee. They were worried about losing the woman who owned most of the company. And in less than an hour, she was about to walk into a boardroom and discover just how big her mistake really was. By 2:45 p.m., the boardroom looked nothing like it normally did. The usual conversations were gone. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was checking sports scores or talking about quarterly targets. The atmosphere felt more like a courtroom than a business meeting. Board members sat quietly reviewing thick legal packets. Lawyers occupied one side of the room. Senior executives avoided eye contact. Everyone understood they were about to witness something major. Then Madison walked in. She wore an expensive cream-colored suit and carried herself with the same confidence she had shown all morning. From the look on her face, she clearly believed she was attending a routine executive meeting. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said with a smile. Nobody smiled back. The room remained silent. Madison hesitated for a moment before walking toward the large chair at the head of the table. Just as she reached it, the chairman of the board cleared his throat. "You may observe today's meeting," he said calmly. "But that seat is reserved." Madison stopped. "Reserved?" she asked. "For who?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence alone made her uncomfortable. Finally, the company's chief attorney closed a folder and looked directly at her. "Mrs. Reed, your executive authority has been suspended pending shareholder review." Madison blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your authority has been suspended." The confidence on her face began to fade. "What are you talking about?" The attorney slid a document across the table. "This morning, you terminated a corporate officer without board authorization. Under Clause 17C of the shareholder agreement, your authority has been automatically revoked." Madison stared at him. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Then she forced a nervous laugh. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding." "It isn't," the attorney replied. Immediately, she looked toward Richard. Surely he would stop this. Surely he would explain. Surely someone would tell the attorney he was wrong. But Richard never spoke. He sat silently staring at the table. The sight terrified her. For the first time all day, the most powerful man she knew looked completely powerless. Madison swallowed hard. "Who filed this?" The chairman leaned back in his chair. "The person you fired." Her face turned pale. "But she's gone." The attorney slowly shook his head. "No, Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. She was never just an employee. The room became completely silent. Every board member already knew the truth. Every investor already knew the truth. Only Madison had remained unaware. The attorney opened another document and placed it in front of her. At the top was a number. 72%. Majority ownership. Voting control. Corporate authority. Madison stared at the page. No. Yes, the attorney replied. For years, she had believed Evelyn Carter was simply an advisor. Someone important, perhaps, but still just an employee. She had never bothered to learn who actually owned the company. Now every assumption she had made was collapsing. The chairman pointed toward an empty chair at the far end of the room. You may observe the proceedings. Observe. Not participate. Not lead. Observe. Humiliated, Madison slowly walked to the seat. The sound of her heels echoed through the silent room. Then, at exactly 3 p.m., the boardroom door opened. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The woman Madison had fired that morning had arrived. And the moment Evelyn Carter stepped into the room, the balance of power changed completely. The boardroom door opened at exactly 3 p.m. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The room became so quiet that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I walked in wearing the same black suit I had worn that morning. No security team. No dramatic entrance. No speech prepared in advance. I simply walked through the door and headed toward the front of the room. Nobody stopped me. Nobody questioned why I was there. Because every person sitting at that table already knew exactly who I was. Madison sat frozen at the far end of the room. The confidence she had carried all morning was gone. Her hands gripped a notebook so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Richard stared down at the table. The board members watched silently. I placed a leather folder in front of the chairman. Then I remained standing. As majority shareholder, I said calmly, I request an immediate review of all executive appointments made during the last 48 hours. The chairman nodded. Request acknowledged. I continued. I also request a vote to suspend all authority granted through those appointments until a complete governance review is conducted. Several board members exchanged glances. Not because they disagreed, because they already knew how the vote would end. When you own 72% of a company, discussions tend to become very short. Across the room, Madison finally found her voice. This is ridiculous. Nobody responded. She turned toward Richard. Say something. For the first time all day, father-in-law and daughter-in-law looked directly at each other. What she saw terrified her. There was no solution in his eyes. No confidence. No authority. Only regret. Richard finally understood something he had ignored for years. The company was never controlled by titles. It was controlled by ownership. And ownership belonged to me. Madison stood up suddenly. There has to be some mistake. The chief attorney calmly slid another folder toward her. There isn't. Inside were shareholder records, legal filings, board agreements, and ownership documents. Every signature was valid. Every filing was legal. Every document confirmed the same reality. I owned the company. Madison slowly sat back down. The room felt smaller now. The power she believed she had that morning had completely disappeared. Then the vote began. One by one, board members recorded their decisions. Every unauthorized appointment was suspended. Every executive change was frozen. Every action taken under Madison's authority was placed under review. The outcome was never in doubt. When the final vote was recorded, the chairman closed the file. The motion passes. The room fell silent. It was over. Hours earlier, Madison had been planning office renovations and leadership announcements. Now she wasn't even part of the decision-making process. She was simply watching her authority disappear. Then Richard finally spoke. His voice sounded older than I remembered. You planned for this? I looked directly at him. No, the room listened carefully. I planned for someone like this. Nobody argued. Because deep down, everyone knew it was true. The clause had not created the disaster. It had prevented one. And for the first time that day, everyone in the room understood the same thing. Madison thought she had fired an employee. Instead, she had challenged the owner. And owners rarely lose. The meeting ended, but the real damage was only beginning. Board members quietly gathered their documents and left the room one by one. Nobody wanted to be the first person to speak. What had happened that afternoon would be talked about for years. Madison remained seated. She stared at the table as if she was still trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Just a few hours earlier, she had walked into the company believing she was part of its future. Now she wasn't even trusted to make decisions. Richard stayed behind after everyone else left. For the first time in decades, he looked exhausted. The confident founder who had once dominated every room was gone. In his place sat an aging businessman facing a reality he could no longer avoid. When the last board member left, Richard looked at me. Can we talk privately? I nodded. We walked into a smaller conference room connected to the boardroom. The door closed behind us. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Finally, Richard leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, I replied. You need to make a decision. I opened my folder and placed 2 documents on the table. One on the left, one on the right. Richard looked down. The first document was a buyout offer. If he accepted, the company would purchase my 72% ownership stake at a premium valuation. The transition would be clean. No lawsuits. No public drama. The second document was much different. It outlined a complete corporate restructuring. I would remain majority shareholder. The executive team would be rebuilt. Departments would be audited. Financial records would be reviewed. Every position would be based on qualifications, not family connections. Richard stared at both documents. Neither option was easy. You're giving me a choice? He asked quietly. I always was. He looked at me for several seconds. Then his eyes dropped back to the papers. I need time. I shook my head. You had time. The words hit harder than I intended. But they were true. For years, warning signs had been ignored. Unqualified people had been promoted. Important decisions had been based on loyalty instead of competence. Now the consequences had arrived. Richard sighed deeply. I never thought it would end like this. I looked directly at him. It doesn't have to. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he asked the question he had been avoiding all afternoon. Do you want revenge? I almost smiled. No. He looked surprised. What I want is accountability. The room fell silent again. Richard stared at the restructuring proposal. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was never about personal feelings. It was about protecting the company. The same company I had spent decades helping build. Finally, he folded the buyout proposal and set it aside. How long do I have? 24 hours. I stood and gathered my folder. As I reached the door, I stopped. There is one more thing. Richard looked up. When Madison walked into my office this morning and fired me, she didn't make a mistake. He frowned. What do you mean? I opened the door. She made a choice. Then I walked away, leaving him alone with the decision that would change the future of the company forever. The next morning, the entire building felt different. Nothing looked unusual on the surface. Employees still arrived carrying coffee. Elevators still opened and closed. Computers still powered on. But underneath it all, everyone knew something had changed. The illusion was gone. For years, people had assumed the company was controlled by the founder and his family. Now they knew the truth. At 8:55 a.m., an email appeared in every executive inbox. The sender was Richard Holloway. The subject line contained only 3 words: effective immediately. Employees opened the message expecting an announcement about restructuring. Instead, they found something nobody expected. Richard was resigning. After decades as founder and CEO, he was stepping down. The message was short and carefully written. He thanked employees for their years of dedication and expressed confidence in the company's future leadership. There was no mention of the board meeting. No mention of Madison. No mention of Clause 17C. Just a quiet resignation. By 9 a.m., rumors were spreading through every floor of the building. Then Madison arrived. Gone was the confident woman who had walked into headquarters the previous morning. Her designer power suit had been replaced by a simple grey blazer. Her eyes looked tired. She hadn't slept. As she approached the executive floor, she'd pressed her badge against the security scanner. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. The light remained red. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Then a security officer approached. He wasn't rude. He wasn't aggressive. He was professional. "Mrs. Reed," he said gently, "I've been instructed to escort you downstairs." The reality finally became impossible to ignore. This time there would be no meetings, no speeches, no negotiations. Her authority was gone. Madison slowly removed the badge from around her neck and handed it over. Then came the company phone, the office keys, the executive access card, everything. Employees watched quietly from nearby hallways. Nobody celebrated. Nobody laughed. The scene was too uncomfortable for that, because everyone understood what they were witnessing. A woman who had been handed power without understanding responsibility. As security escorted her through the lobby, she looked up at the large digital display showing executive leadership. The screen had already been updated. Her name was gone, completely erased. For a moment, she stood there staring. Then she lowered her eyes and walked toward the exit. She never looked back. Upstairs, a new executive meeting was beginning. Not a meeting filled with family members or political allies. A meeting filled with experienced professionals. Lawyers, financial specialists, governance experts. People selected because they could do the job, not because of who they knew. At exactly 9 a.m., I entered the conference room. This time, nobody questioned my presence. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody needed an explanation, because the entire company finally understood what had always been true. I wasn't returning to power. I had never lost it. And as I took my seat at the head of the table, the rebuilding of the company officially began. The rebuilding process started immediately. There were no press releases, no victory speeches, no dramatic celebrations. Real leadership rarely looks like that. Instead, there were audits, meetings, reviews, and long hours spent fixing problems that had been ignored for years. Every department was evaluated. Every executive role was reviewed. Every major decision made during the previous months was carefully examined. The goal wasn't revenge. It was stability. For too long, people had confused family connections with leadership. Now the company would operate differently. 1 week later, the board held another meeting. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. There was no tension, no panic, no emergency clauses, just professionals doing their jobs. The restructuring plan was approved unanimously. New executives were appointed based on qualifications. Governance policies were strengthened. Financial controls were updated. And for the first time in years, everyone seemed focused on the same objective: protecting the company. After the meeting ended, I walked through the headquarters alone. The hallways looked exactly the same. The offices hadn't changed. The furniture was still where it had always been. But something felt different. People nodded when they passed. Employees stopped pretending they didn't know who was responsible for keeping the company together. Respect had replaced assumptions. As I passed the IT department, the director smiled. "Everything's been restored," he said. "Good," I replied. When I reached the compliance floor, I noticed that the old executive organizational chart had been removed from the wall. Only a few small holes remained where it had once hung. A simple reminder that titles can disappear much faster than people expect. Eventually, I made my way to the lobby. The same lobby I had walked through 8 days earlier after being fired. The same front desk. The same reception area. The same glass doors. But this time, nobody was escorting me out. The receptionist smiled. "Good morning, Miss Carter." I smiled back. Then I placed a folder on the desk. "What is this?" she asked. "A request for a new access badge." She laughed softly. "I think we can arrange that." As I turned toward the exit, sunlight poured through the glass entrance. For a moment I stopped and looked back at the building. People often think power comes from a title on a business card. Others believe it comes from a family name. Some think it comes from the corner office. They're wrong. Real power comes from understanding how everything works when nobody is paying attention. It's hidden inside contracts, inside ownership agreements, inside systems that most people never bother to learn. Madison thought she could remove me with a signature. Richard thought control belonged to whoever sat in the biggest office. They both learned the same lesson. Power isn't something you announce. It's something you build. One decision at a time. One contract at a time. 1 year at a time. And when the dust finally settled, everyone remembered exactly who had built the foundation beneath their feet. Not because I returned, but because I had never truly left.